When I was a boy, my parents owned a summer place in northern Vermont. It wasn't much. It had been the hired hand's house on a dairy farm. My folks bought the house, and they also bought an acre of land to go with it. It didn't have running water. We used a chemical toilet that I can smell to this day. And we hauled our drinking water in gallon jars from the farm. It didn't have electricity. We used kerosene lamps at night and ate canned tuna and Spam. If I never see any more Spam in my life, I'll be glad. It really was rather ramshackle at best. The house was perched about halfway up a very long dirt road, many miles long, that climbed a hill. It was far from the nearest town and half a state away from any city of any size at all. We always went there for a couple of weeks in August, just about this time of year. And while my brothers and I found lots to do during the day, everything from picking wild blackberries to chasing after cows, what I remember most about the place was the nighttime sky. It was alive with starlight. You could clearly discern the Milky Way, and there were more stars than we ever saw at home in town. It was truly magnificent. Sometimes we would even be treated to the northern lights. The very sight of those stars filled some inner need for connection. As poet Ann Porter writes, "They're brimming drops of light, so fresh, so clear, that when you look at them, it quenches your thirst." Indeed, even though I was just a boy, I remember well being inspired by those stars to think about the grander things in life, including the majesty of God. It is very little wonder that my paternal grandmother provided the name for that house when she called it Heaven High. Heaven High. I imagine Abraham marveled at the same stars in much the same way. He was, after all, a shepherd. And shepherds often find themselves all alone on a hilltop in the middle of a dark night. Indeed, the encounter with God recorded in today's lesson appears to have happened at night. Perhaps Abraham is about to nod off in front of the fire as his sheep and goats are bedded down for the night all around him. His trusty dogs are keeping watch and keeping the wolves at bay. And above him stretches a panoply of stars. Suddenly a new light shines brightly in the sky, and a voice speaks. "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield." The shepherd rubs his eyes, not quite sure, but he knows the voice. It's the voice of Yahweh, the voice of the Lord. In an earlier passage, Abraham has been promised offspring by God, but he and his wife Sarah are very elderly, and there has been no child. He has sired a boy by his wife's handmaid Hagar, but his wife Sarah remains childless. It has been a very dark night for both of them. A very dark night in a day and time when culture was all built around who your male heir was going to be. So God appears on the scene to reassure Abraham. You will have a son, he says. You will have a son by Sarah. And that son shall have children, and his children even more. Look, Abraham, look at the stars. Count them if you can. You will have more descendants than there are stars. In time, Sarah does give birth to a son, Isaac. And Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And they have sons and daughters, and on and on and on. More descendants than stars in the sky. But it doesn't happen right away. The darkness of being childless continues for quite some time after this episode in Abraham's life. The darkness of that experience goes on. But the stars come out every night. And Abraham is able to look up and be reminded that he has been promised an heir, a son. Indeed, more heirs than he can count. While this lovely little story about a divine human encounter is specific to the story of God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, it also speaks in its own way about the importance of such reminders, the importance of things like stars that give us hope when the night is long and the way is dark. Signs and symbols that inspire us, that connect us to the grander realities of life. One of the most beloved of all modern painters is Vincent van Gogh. And his most beloved painting is undoubtedly Starry, Starry Night. Take a moment to look in your bulletin. I've enclosed a print of it. That's yours to keep. You know the painting, I'm sure. It's well known. It's gorgeous. What you may not know is that both Van Gogh's life and that painting itself are shrouded in darkness. Born in 1853, Vincent died only a few decades later in 1890. He lived to be 37. He was known to be quite eccentric and probably suffered from mental illness. He was the son of a pastor, and he himself even served for a period of time as a missionary among the poor of Belgium. At one point in his life, he gave away all of his possessions to those who were in need. In time, he discovered the world of art and began to paint. He determined that he could best serve God by being an artist. And so that's what he became. In 1885, he had a breakthrough with his famous painting, The Potato Eaters. Over the last 5 years of his life, he would move to the south of France. And there Van Gogh wavered between a life of sanity and a life marked by great mental and emotional hardship and challenge. It was during such a time that he famously cut off part of his ear. In 1889, Van Gogh sought help at the local mental hospital, what was then called an asylum at Saint-Rémy. Even though he was hospitalized, he continued to paint. And it was there, while in the asylum, that he created Starry, Starry Night. The painting, Starry, Starry Night, represents his view outside of the bedroom window of the asylum. It took him 3 nights to complete, for he painted it when that scene was actually before him. And in order to be able to see in those pre-electrified days, he is said to hung candles off of the brim of his hat so that he could see the canvas in front of him. Throughout his life, Van Gogh kept up an active correspondence with his brother, Theo. And in a letter written at the time, he spoke of Starry, Starry Night. He speaks of technical matters like his use of the color blue and the shapes of the trees. But he also speaks of his inspiration. Why, he asks, why shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots of the map of France? And earlier in that same letter, in a rather wistful tone, he notes, "Looking at the stars always makes me dream." Looking at the stars always makes me dream. No doubt Abraham dreamed of offspring as he gazed at the nighttime sky. No doubt you too dream as you look at the stars. Maybe you even make a wish on the first star you see at night, expressing a dream. You too do that, even as I did it as a boy in northern Vermont. In southern Vermont, at the old Bennington Congregational Church, one can find the grave of another artist, one who painted not with oils and acrylics, but with words. You know his name too, Robert Frost. Perhaps he captures the importance of such reminders, such symbols in our lives better than anyone in one of his most powerful poems. O star, the fairest one at night, we grant your loftiness the right to some obscurity of cloud. It will not do to say of night, since dark is what brings out your light. Some mystery becomes the proud, but to be wholly taciturn in your reserve is not allowed. Say something to us we can learn by heart, and when alone repeat. Say something, and it says, I burn. But say with what degree of heat. Talk Fahrenheit, talk centigrade. Use language we can comprehend. Tell us what elements you blend. It gives us strangely little aid, but does tell something in the end. And steadfast as Keats' eremite, not stooping from its sphere, it asks little of us here. It asks of us a certain height. So when at times the mob is swayed to carry praise or blame too far, we may take something like a star to stay our minds on and be stayed. Look up at the heavens, says the Holy One. Look up at the heavens and count the stars. Look at the stars and dream. Look up at the stars and be stayed, be steadied. Look up at the stars and be reminded of the grandeur, the majesty, and the wonder of God. Be reminded that you are not alone, even in the darkest of the night. You are not alone. Look up at the stars and be reminded that God goes with you. Amen. It's always good to have an excuse to sing those evening hymns that we never get to sing because we worship in the morning. Always good to have a chance to see the stars at night because they do indeed remind us of the light of God's love. Always good to see our own star, the sun, come up above the horizon for another day's adventure because it reminds us that God's love is more faithful than the rising and setting of the sun itself. Always good to see the faces of Hal Gibson, Ginger Dornberg, Peter Hilger, Amy Dietz. Always good. Always good to remember that you and I are loved by one whose love knows no bounds whatsoever. No bounds at all. Look, the stars, Abram. Count them if you can. God's love is greater than that. Amen.